Well, everyone, it's time for us to talk about the M1 iPad Pros and see how these iPads have been holding up in the, year of 2022. Now, I'm getting kind of late into this specific review, mostly because of iPadOS 16. It was actually pretty insane to me how much of these specific iPads with the M1 chipsets have actually changed up, and I'm actually kind of surprised that Apple did so many different things with these iPads to differentiate these iPads compared to their predecessors. Now, I'll get into all the details and everything in a minute, but with something like the M1 iPad Pro, this specific iPad is still being sold by Apple, but a really, really big thing just changed. The M2 chipset just actually ended up coming out. Now, it's been a little bit over a year since this iPad Pro has been on the market. If I had to guess, we could potentially get another iPad Pro with the M2 chipset as soon as potentially October or November. I think it's probably going to come in 2023, but just know that in the next couple of months, we could be seeing an M2 iPad Pro probably in the works. And that in and of itself, I think, is actually going to be pretty insane if we get another successor to this thing immediately right after this device. Now, it's been a year and a half, so keep that in mind. Now, I will say on top of that, if you have all the money in the world, buying an M1 iPad Pro is probably the best decision possible, mostly because of the device stipulations that Apple has put in with an iPadOS 16. So within this iPad software, really wasn't even that crazy big of a jump in terms of performance or, increase in stability or anything like that, as far as we can tell from iPadOS 15. It brought one particular feature that has been very controversial, which is Stage Manager. Now, this is probably the biggest thing that's going on with these iPad Pros right now with the M1 chipset. Apparently, Apple stated the M1 iPads can only support Stage Manager and the other ones can't because of some chipset things or whatever. It looks like the M1 iPad Air 5 doesn't actually have this type of capability, so that was potentially could have been a lie from Apple, which was very strange. But with this specific iPad Pro, when I actually look at it, I can't actually believe that these iPads have stayed the same in terms of design and everything from the 2018 iPad, but the fact that Apple limited so many older features of these iPads on these older ones, but kept the M1 iPad Pro. Now, I think that's a good thing for the iPad Pro, but it's a weird thing for some other, devices, to be honest. Now, on the outside of the M1 iPad Pro, it almost looks identically the same as the iPad Air 5, which is substantially cheaper than the specific iPad. So with this iPad, the M1 iPad Pro, they come in two different models, a smaller 11-inch model and a bigger 12.9-inch model. So I do think that's great. I love having the type of, differentiating factor. If you want a bigger one or a smaller one, you have that type of capability here, which I think is really cool in and of itself. Now, we still have a beautiful display on these things, ProMotion display. The 12.9-inch model does have a higher end display, if you want to call it that, but still the 11-inch model that I had a beautiful display. And I will say, coming from my 11-inch iPad Pro from 2018, that thing also had a really good display. So I'm not really feeling like one's extremely better than the other one, but I do like the fact that these specific iPads have that type of capability within these iPads, which I think is really cool in and of itself. Now, we still have USB Type-C ports on these things, but these are now Thunderbolt ports. So we have the capability of actually utilizing these things as a different monitor of some sort, which I think is really cool. So we can go and connect these things and use them as a different display, which I think that in and of itself is also really, really cool. Now, on the back, we do have that camera setup, which I think is really awesome. We have, they call it the Pro camera setup, which I think is kind of good. I mean, it's a wide and an ultra-wide sensor. It's a 12 megapixel wide and then a 10 megapixel ultra-wide sensor. Now, I do feel like Apple could do a little bit better with these cameras. I feel like they can add a telephoto lens. They have the LiDAR scanner in there, but as I mentioned before, I don't really know too many people who are actively using the LiDAR sensor every single day, but I do think in the future it's probably going to come at a really good time where the LiDAR sensors on our iPhones can really, really come in handy. Now, personally, as of right now, I will probably tell you with something like these iPad Pros, they are still very good cameras. If you need something where you just need to go ahead and pick it up and use it as an everyday iPad or whatever, well, you have that capability, but you also have a really good camera built in. And I've always found that to be really, really good. Whenever you have an iPad like this, it's going to have a fairly solid type of camera quality. So I think that's a really cool thing. My only concern with this type of iPad, though, is that the lack of telephoto lens kind of puts this in a weird situation where this is not as good as an iPhone 13 camera, mostly because it has a lower megapixel ultra-wide sensor. It has a better front-facing camera, but I do find it weird that the M1 iPad Pro could have probably gotten a little bit better in terms of that, in terms of the camera quality, but regardless, still very good, and I don't have too much to complain about it in that standpoint. So, in terms of camera, it looks great. I will say also in terms of stability, performance, all that stuff, this is also a very, very good iPad too. I don't really have too much to complain about it in that standpoint. But the problem I have with this iPad is the fact that Apple has kind of mushed a lot of these iPads together that are very strange. So they kind of are matching the M iPad series and the A series of iPads, and they're keeping them different. So before, all the iPads that had the certain chipset, they could be able to do X, Y, and Z. But now, with the iPad mini 6, that is actually having a much more limited version of software than the iPad, M1 iPad Pro and the M1 iPad Air. So because of that, these M1 iPad chipsets are in a really good position, where the A series of chipsets are in a really weird position. Apple is almost treating their A series of devices as an Intel chipset like they did with their MacBooks. It's very strange. Apple made these A chipsets together, so, they shouldn't go ahead and keep them out of business. They can easily support them. I've done several speed tests from an M chipset device from Apple, like an iPad, and an A series of device from Apple, and a lot of the times they're very similar performing, so I don't really understand what's going on there. I will say also the price tag of these iPads have gone down a little bit in the used market. I don't know if these things have hit the certified refurbished Apple Store yet. There's probably a high chance that they have, but if not, these things are going all over the place in the used market, and that's another big area where you can go and snag these things up. I've seen, just from this specific, website right here, I'm seeing some for around $800 for the 12.9-inch model. The 11-inch model is going for, I believe, around $700 too, which I'm sure if you get a student discount, they're probably around the same price in the brand new market too. So you have a little bit of flexibility there. I think with the M1 iPad Pro, this is a very interesting iPad. It's not like the first iPad I would recommend people to go ahead and buy. If you have all the money, then go for it. This thing has it all. But I don't think it's the best value per dollar, and I do think with the weird things Apple has been doing with software, it's only a matter of time before this thing is outdated as well. If you think about it, the iPad mini 6 that just came out with the latest and greatest chipset that's inside of our iPhones, Apple is now saying that that chipset is unsuperior to their M series of chipsets. And I have a really big problem with that. Until Apple goes ahead and puts their M series of chipsets on all their devices, we are pretty much always going to have a very limited version of software of all the different versions of devices that Apple has. So I'm not a fan of that. I like when devices are, slowly going out, but I don't like it when they go ahead and cut all the features at one time. And from this type of artificial stipulation from previous devices and newer ones, it doesn't really make too much sense to me. So the performance is great on this iPad. Battery life is pretty much great on this iPad. Everything is great on this iPad. And that's kind of how I would sum it up. It's almost like the perfect iPad for you. The only thing Apple can probably do in the next generations are increase the panel size, so decrease the bezel around it. They can go ahead and increase the battery life, and they can go ahead and upgrade the camera once more. I don't think they've done that since the 4th generation iPad Pro. And those are pretty much the main things they can do. On top of that, they could potentially add another USB Type-C port on these things, maybe an extra port of some sort on these iPads too, but I don't see them going much more beyond that. I think this is going to stay consistent. I think the design is pretty much, at its peak in my opinion, and I guess we're going to see what happens in the future, but I still think this iPad is worth picking up. It's very interesting for sure, but I guess we'll see what happens in the future. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.